All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. This is Adam Gurza with Energy Toolbase. As always, I want to start by saying thank you for taking time out of your busy day to check out our webinar today. We have got a lot of great material prepared that we're going to be sharing with you. And a lot of this stuff is kind of hot off the press because all three of us over here were up late last night kind of getting some of this stuff prepared. So you already know the title of today's webinar is the 2018 California Market Overview, C&I Energy Storage Projects, SGIP Rebates, and PACE Financing. So, this is a little different than normal on webinars. We're covering a few more topics than we normally do at once, but I think we're going to demonstrate how a lot of this is very much interrelated here. Okay, cool. So before I introduce my co-presenters, I've got two quick housekeeping items. Number one, this is being recorded, and you should get an automated email 1 hour after this with the link to the recording. And number two, this is absolutely intended to be a live and interactive webinar. So we encourage you to ask questions. We're targeting to make the prepared section of the webinar about 45 minutes in total, and then we'll leave 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. Okay, cool. Without any further ado, let me set up and introduce my co-presenters and also the agenda for today. So Laura Gray, the Energy Storage Policy Advisor at CALSEIA, is going to kick it off. And Laura's going to give us a good deep dive overview on the SGIP program and kind of the current state of the market, focusing on the C&I segment of the market, and also kind of touching on some other policy issues like rate design to be aware of in 2018 as we think about, storage project viability in California. Then Jonathan Pickering, the Managing Director at K2 Clean Energy Capital, is going to start with kind of an overview on the PACE market, some of the legislation that came out of 2017, and just kind of an overview and state of the market looking forward at 2018. Jonathan's going to talk through kind of how PACE is financing solar projects and storage projects and energy efficiency projects, and kind of talk about some of the underwriting criteria and benefits of PACE financing. And then I'm going to go last and do a quick overview of the K2 PACE financing application on the Energy Toolbase platform. For my segment, I'm going to be spending most of my time on a case study portion where we're really going to be kind of diving deeply, modeling solar plus storage projects, utilizing SGIP rebates, and financing through PACE. And then we'll kind of just talk more broadly about ways for developers to identify the best storage projects that are out there and kind of some other development best practices. So that's the next 45 minutes. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Laura Gray. And get your deck up here, Laura, to take it away.
Awesome. Thanks, Adam. So as Adam mentioned, I'm Laura Gray, Energy Storage Policy Advisor for the California Solar Energy Industries Association. And for those of you who don't know, CALSEIA is a nonprofit trade association advocating for local solar and storage. And we have over 500 members, including dozens of storage companies. We also have, hundreds of solar business members who are interested in storage or who have already incorporated storage into their business models. So if you're not a member and you're interested in storage, please be in touch. We're working hard to create a storage market in California. So next slide. So I'll give a brief overview of storage in California and the self-generation incentive program. In my mind, the behind-the-meter C&I market is SGIP. There are very few projects going forward in this state without the SGIP incentive. So for purposes of this presentation, I think we can assume that SGIP is the C&I market. However, CALSEIA and others are working really hard to create other revenue streams, including storage-friendly rates, access to demand response programs, favorable codes, providing ancillary services, and procurement opportunities, among other value stack ideas. So I think the future will look a lot different from SGIP, but this is where we're at. So what is SGIP? SGIP is an incentive program for renewable technologies created by the Public Utilities Commission. So there's currently $450 million available for storage, including $330 million for large-scale storage projects. And large-scale, I should mention, are those projects sized over 10 kilowatts. So out of that $330 million available for large-scale storage, $130 million has already been reserved. And the SGIP incentive is based on the energy capacity and is calculated in cents per watt hour. So we'll get into the incentive a little later. A recent policy change within the SGIP program that you should be aware of is the equity budget. So the Public Utilities Commission recently decided to reserve $70 million or 25% of total storage funding for projects in low-income and disadvantaged communities and for low-income households across the state. So I'll get into the equity budget a little later, but there are definitely opportunities for developers within that equity budget. Some of the other program policies that you should definitely be aware of include the goals of the SGIP program. So the program and its iterations throughout the years have created program goals that now include reducing greenhouse gas emissions, market transformation, and reducing peak demand. So I mention this because a recent report found some SGIP systems were not reducing greenhouse gas emissions. CALSEIA and other stakeholders are working really collaboratively with the IOUs and the Public Utilities Commission, but I think because of this greenhouse gas issue, you could see some program changes in the spring. So definitely something to be aware of. Okay, next slide. Okay, so this is really what the SGIP program looks like in terms of current reservations for large-scale storage. I should mention that very few of these projects are actually in operation, but once a reservation is confirmed, developers have around 18 months to actually build the system. So on the left pie chart, you see there large storage projects by numbers. So there are nearly 450 commercial projects so far reserved in the SGIP program. 250 government projects, 49 nonprofit projects, and 80 large residential projects. I mentioned the large residential piece because residential projects over 10 kW do draw from the large storage budget. There's also a small residential storage budget that I didn't include here today, but there is a good amount of money available for residential projects under 10 kW. The pie chart on the right is the storage capacity by megawatt hours. So there's nearly 170 megawatt hours reserved for commercial storage projects so far in the SGIP program. Okay, next chart. So this is a chart of how much storage was deployed nationally in 2016. And I like to show this chart to demonstrate California's leadership on storage and how impactful the SGIP program will be for storage across the country. So compare that 300 megawatt hours of storage that I showed in the last chart with all the storage that was installed in the country in 2016. The arrow there is pointing to behind the meter non-residential storage. Around 54 megawatts was installed across the country in 2016. So, I mean, SGIP in California are really outsized voices in the storage market, and it's interesting to compare where we're at, you know, with sort of the national picture. Next slide. Okay, so this chart's kind of hard to read, but this is all the SGIP developers for large commercial projects. So kind of a crazy chart, but it shows the diversity of developers in the SGIP program. As you can see, there are over 50 developers just for commercial projects. And so there's 50 developers, but I can tell you there's just new players entering the market every day, and lots of solar developers and other storage developers who are interested in getting in on this. Okay, next chart. So this is a representation of the SGIP manufacturers so far for commercial projects. So you can see there's a little less diversity when it comes to project manufacturers, but there's still a lot of companies manufacturing C&I storage. Probably some names that you recognize and some that you might not, including a couple flow battery companies and a handful of thermal storage companies. Next slide. Okay, so this chart represents average storage project size and duration for different host customer sectors, as well as reported cost per kilowatt hour on average. So if you look at that top line with the commercial projects, the average size is 184 kilowatt, 378 kilowatt hour system with a little over 2-hour duration. And so the reported eligible cost for that was around $1,063 per kilowatt hour. And that means that the storage developer reported that the eligible cost for the project to be included in the SGIP program was around $1,063 per kilowatt hour. So it could be fairly accurate, but it depends on what the developer is reporting to the SGIP program. Okay, next slide. Okay, and now here is the SGIP budget. So you can see the different IOU territories. All of the IOU territories are currently in step 2, except for Southern California Edison, which is in step 3. And they exhausted their step 2 budget last fall, and step 3 opened on January 11th. So as you can see, there's still $30 million left in Southern California Edison for step 3. But if you look at the incentive level, it's around 5 cents lower than the other IOU territories, which are still in step 2. So currently, Southern California Edison, 35 cents a watt hour for projects that do not take the ITC tax incentives, and 25 cents a watt hour for projects that do take the ITC. So as you can see, there's still a lot of money left in Center for Sustainable Energy and Pacific Gas and Electric for step 2 large-scale storage projects. Southern California Gas, with only $261,000 left in step 2, maybe the next IOU territory to close step 2. That could be around one project, but you might see Center for Sustainable Energy closing first. It's hard to tell, though I do think there has been a good trickle of projects in the last couple months. Next slide. And so before I mentioned the equity budget, so this is the money available for the large-scale equity budget. As I mentioned, there's around $70 million available for equity budget projects. And eligible projects include small businesses located in a disadvantaged or low-income community, government, nonprofit, or educational entities in low-income or disadvantaged communities, and multifamily housing across the state. There's also money available for residential single-family homes across the state as well. As you can see here, the only equity budget step that's open is Southern California Edison, because the equity budget opens in concert with the large-scale step 3 opening. Okay, next slide. So as I mentioned briefly before, and as you can see from the previous slides, SGIP really is the foundation of storage in California. But CALSEIA and others really believe that this picture will look a lot different in the coming years. And one of the biggest changes as of late has been the shift in peak periods for time of use customers. And so that shift is really represented here in this chart. You can see the old peak periods in dark blue, aligning nicely with solar production, and the new proposed peak periods in that teal color. So SDG&E is already established, that 4 to 9 peak period you can see there in the teal. PG&E is in process, and we expect Southern California Edison to have a very similar peak period. So I think Adam may get more into the impact of rates on storage, but as you can see, storage will be immensely valuable to time of use customers to shift load and manage peak demand charges. So again, while SGIP is really predominant now, CALSEIA really envisions storage compensation coming from a sort of response to dynamic rate signals that are reflecting grid needs. And so for storage-specific C&I rates in general rate cases, we've been advocating for a high differential between peak and off-peak in winter and summer. And we've also been advocating for more coincident peak demand charges. The other sort of value stack that we've been working on is mostly aligned with, compensation for storage providing other grid needs. That includes demand response, access to wholesale markets, ancillary services, procurement opportunities, etc. So that's sort of our quick vision of SGIP and where we see storage in the future. And I'm excited to turn it over to my co-panelists.
Quick reminder too, Jonathan, before you step in, some good questions coming in. Keep them coming. We've got 10 to 15 minutes kind of budgeted at the end. And I think a lot of these questions will be targeted at Laura, but chat over any questions and we're going to take them at the end. So Jonathan, you are up.
Okay, thank you, Laura. Thank you, Adam. My name is John Pickering. I'm the co-founder of K2 Clean Energy Capital. We're actually celebrating our 5th year in business this month, and we are a leading energy project developer and a specialist in PACE financing. So to tee this up, I just want to quote from an article at Green Tech Media from last July, and it says, if the energy storage market is to grow, there's going to have to be more widely available low-cost financing. So today we're going to talk about that, some of those low-cost financing options with a focus on PACE. But first I'll start off with the latest updates on the California PACE legislation. PACE has now funded over $4.3 billion of residential PACE projects and around $520 million in commercial projects nationwide. The vast majority of both of those segments is actually in California. And the growth has been extraordinarily fast, especially for residential. Now, overall, the resi default rates have been really excellent compared to other kinds of financing, but inevitably with that volume, you're going to have some consumer complaints, and there's been pressure from lobby groups, which has resulted in legislation for consumer protection. Now, the legislation is mainly around first improved disclosures, checks for homeowners, checks on homeowners' ability to pay back, the affordability. And lastly, in AB 1284, there is going to be coming in 2019, more regulations around who can solicit for PACE, and there's going to be training programs and regulate those PACE financing with customers. But overall, there's going to be no meaningful impact on the commercial PACE side. And overall, we in the PACE business and sector believe that we're still very early days in PACE, and that this type of innovative financing is just going to continue to grow. Next slide, please, Adam. So first, we're going to talk about just the general considerations when we're looking at a solar plus storage project. I mean, the key question is obviously going to be the bottom line. Is it going to pencil out for your client? And normally when we first run these, we just look at the economics from a simple, cash opportunity to see what the straight line ROI looks like. So there are three considerations I really want to highlight today. One is obviously, as Laura talked about, to be able to quantify and understand all the incentives available, the SGIP and the depreciation, the ITC. Secondly, through Energy Toolbase, a fantastic opportunity to optimize the PV and the storage system size, and obviously quantify the energy savings. So I'll move on to the next box, which is very critical on the storage side, and that is the understanding the maintenance costs. It's we're all used to, on the PV side, budgeting for an inverter replacement. On the storage side, it's obviously more complex because the batteries are going to have a finite lifetime, they're going to have service costs, and the the lifetime of the battery and performance is going to be very application specific. So when we're running a 10 or 15, 20-year financing, we've got to understand what those replacement costs are going to be. So it relies working very, very closely with the storage system supplier, and obviously the owner of the system is going to want to do his due diligence in understanding the long-term support costs for the project, and that all needs to be entered into Energy Toolbase. And then the third important consideration is obviously who is providing the storage system. That's a very key factor, particularly if we're using a PPA or other kind of third-party financing. But it's also an important consideration because some of the battery suppliers, or particularly integrated companies, are going to be able to offer their own in-house financing for the battery storage system. So let me move on now, please, Alan, to the next slide. So let's talk about the financing options. The first decision is obviously whether the host wants to own the system or whether you're going to need to look at third-party financing like a PPA. Now, for-profit organizations that can use the tax credits are more likely to opt for a direct financing where they own the system. And the main options that I've highlighted in this chart under direct financing are PACE, which we'll talk about in detail, straightforward equipment financing, which is typically going to have a 7 to maximum 10-year term. The payments are going to be higher. Monthly payments are going to be relatively high compared to long-term financing with PACE, but the overall financing costs are going to be lower. And then obviously the third option is cash, or for the client to self-finance from its own bank. But then the cash is tied up. Cash could be used for other core business requirements. And then the second choice is obviously to go to third-party financing. I think we're all familiar with standard power purchase agreements. And I think the good news is now that several PPA companies now are able to offer standard power purchase agreements for solar plus storage. The next option I want to mention is PACE with a new kind of power purchase agreement we call a deposit or a prepaid PPA, where you prepay for power for say 12 years, and we use PACE to raise the cash for that prepayment. The owner doesn't get the full ITC discount, but they can get maybe a 15 to 20% discount on the system price. And then after 6 years, typically the ownership is going to flip back to the host, and it's a very good and cost-effective path to ownership for a solar and storage system. And then the third option is a lease, a true lease. That's only available for for-profit customers, but tend to have shorter financing terms, 7, maximum 10 years, but the overall interest rate is negative, and that's also, I think, an exciting option for solar plus storage systems. Let me move on now. I'm going to talk in a bit more detail about what is commercial PACE financing. Just generally, I think we've all seen special tax assessments on the property tax bill, often to finance schools or roads or lighting. Now, PACE is exactly the same concept, but with PACE, the special tax assessment is to finance on your own building, your own improvements, and they could be energy efficiency, water efficiency, PV, and cogeneration, and obviously storage as well is included. Now, the amount that can be financed through PACE depends primarily on the value of the property. We can typically finance around maximum of 20% of property value. So for a $5 million building, we can finance around $1 million. The terms are pretty flexible, from 15 up to 25 years, which is typically much longer than typical lease or loan, enabling lower payments. And it's 100% financing to cover all the design, consulting, permitting costs, as well as obviously the system and labor. And the key thing here is the longer the term, the lower the payment. And we we obviously want to get the payments as low as possible in order to generate a positive cash flow. So that's kind of a quick overview, and let's move on to the next slide, which is, as I highlighted earlier, around 520 million, 1,150 commercial projects funded. We're focusing on California today, and California has an excellent program. We have multiple funders, multiple administrators, which gives a lot of flexibility for contractors and building owners to have flexibility on and have different choices. And one of the things that K2 does is through K2 Clean Energy Capital, we help you navigate through that through the landscape. The other message here is PACE is alive and well, and getting very strong programs emerging now in the Midwest and in Florida and Texas across the nation. Next slide, please, Adam. So I'm going to go through the basic PACE underwriting criteria and how the payments are set up. So the first point to note is only the owner can commit to PACE financing. The owner needs to sign the commitment on the assessment contract. The owner needs to be current on the property tax payments on their mortgages, and they, any bankruptcy raises a red flag. We do need to have checks on financials just to make sure that it's affordable. We're typically looking for the last 3 years of financials. And critically, we do require lender consent. If there's a mortgage and a deed of trust on the title, the mortgage holder must give consent for the building owner to go ahead with the PACE assessment contract. As mentioned before, we can finance around 20% loan to value. The minimum PACE amount that we generally work with is around $250,000. For non-profits with the prepaid PPA structure, we need to have slightly larger projects of 500,000 minimum to make that viable. And then the payment application needs to be obviously approved by the funder and also the administrator. Now, how it works in terms of the payments is the PACE funds are deposited directly into a trust account upon closing. The payments to the out of that funder will have to be authorized by the building owner and co-signed by the funder. And payments the good thing is that payments can be made directly to the contractor out of that fund. And normally all of those milestones we have pre-agreed and signed off before the project is funded. Next slide, please. Just want to highlight in the next slide here the key benefits. The first one I want to mention is that PACE, with PACE, the system is owned by the host, by the building owner, and it's really the owner that's making that technology decision. And in storage right now, there's obviously a lot of newer technologies, and PACE will give you more flexibility in terms of the vendors you can work with. When we go to a third-party financing where it's owned by the owner is going to be taking the tax credits and the depreciation, they're extremely obviously focused on the bankability of the storage supplier, which will give some constraints. And also in those PPA contracts, there are going to be performance guarantees, which the contractor is going to be responsible for. So probably from the contractor perspective, having the project funded through PACE or a loan is going to make things a little simpler. Two general benefits on PACE is that the owner's credit is less critical. It doesn't require personal financial statements. It doesn't require reviews of 1040s. It doesn't require personal guarantees. Having said that, we do need to get the bank, any mortgage holders, lender consent before we can move ahead. And some of the key benefits of PACE is that we're finding that most businesses are treating this PACE financing as off balance sheet. If the building is sold, the financing transfers directly to the new owner upon sale. There's no complications. It's straightforward. And if, in the worst case, the owner cannot make the payment, it doesn't accelerate. It's not like your mortgage where the bank can call in the mortgage. You're only due that missing payment. And in fact, the lien on the property is not for the whole base financing amount. It's only for that 1 year of payments. So there are a number of subtleties to base financing that need to be explained very carefully to the owners of the building and the financial staff. So there's a number of nuances. It's certainly nothing like a normal loan. Next slide, please, Adam. And then we worked over the last few years to develop this application in Energy Toolbase to make it easy and simple for Energy Toolbase users to get PACE financing proposals. And these are the three benefits. One is it just takes far less time. I think we all love the ability. We can work with Helioscope. We can use the utility API to pull in all the data. We can go through the optimization, different solar sites, PV sizes, different storage sizes, very fast toggling. We have a nice customized proposal template. So everything's in one place. But when with the PACE app that we developed, one thing we were focused on, well, how do we make this accurate? Now, this isn't meant to be the final quote, but we want to give reasonably accurate indicative quotes. So what we have in the platform is a real-time interest rate lookup. So that quote will be accurate for when you generate the quote. We have an online property report check. So if there's good information in the public record about the assessed value and mortgage information, you'll be able to pull that up. And just overall, there's just less room for error because everything's in one place. And then finally, the support side, K2 provides, you can help you navigate this. We're experts in PACE and we can help you on the project execution. Finally, I'm just going to wrap up with a couple of recent projects. Adam, can you hear me? If we can go to the next slide. These are interesting. The first one on the left is at the River Shopping Mall in Rancho Mirage. It's a 667 kilowatt solar canopy. We actually used one of the prepaid PPA structures I mentioned before, and PACE was used to finance the deposit. Although it's a for-profit organization, the tax appetite wasn't great, and the prepaid PPA was an attractive option. We did actually look at storage on this project, but the load profile is very flat. We've financed another project, also a 450 kilowatts canopy project on a golf course in Rancho Mirage, and we also used a PACE plus a prepaid PPA for that project. And the largest project we've funded is actually an $8.5 million project with Version Corporation in Fremont. So the range in project sizes can go from a couple of $100,000 to $8 to $10 million plus. So you have a lot of flexibility on the PACE financing. Well, thank you very much for your attention. Over to Adam.
Awesome. Great job, Jonathan. Okay, I think I'm going to start my section. I definitely have a few things I'm excited to run through here, but why don't I pick up right where you left off, Jonathan, and start by just doing a really quick kind of 30-second overview for Energy Toolbase users to show you how to access that K2 PACE application right in our platform. So I'm in a demo account here, and I'm going to navigate to the company settings. This isn't the most intuitive thing in the world, so that's kind of why we routinely kind of show you exactly where this lives. So in your company settings, under the third-party services tab is where basically all of our third-party integrations are going to live, and you're certainly going to be seeing some more logos here in the coming months, which we're excited about. Here's the K2 app. In this case, we're clicking to apply for access to the service, and you can see the terms and conditions and requirements of K2. There's also a downloadable dealer agreement that you can look through, and certainly you can take this offline with Jonathan. But the key point here is that it is a dual opt-in process, meaning the Energy Toolbase user has to apply to access this service, and K2 has to approve you. Okay, so that's the sign up. Actually, there's one other thing I want to plug before I forget, and that is right off of our main website. If you go to the resource guide section, we've actually got a pretty cool resource guide that's downloadable that really details kind of all aspects of this integration, signing up, using it, generating quotes, kind of rehashing a lot of that stuff Jonathan just talked about on underwriting and requirements. So I kind of also want to quickly plug this if you want further guidance on using this integration or thinking about using this integration. Okay, now comes the fun stuff. So let me jump into another account where I've got some deals set up already. And now I'm going to kind of transition back and talk about modeling a California solar plus storage project, and then we're going to kind of layer in some PACE financing. So I've already got a deal pre-configured here. Let me just kind of talk you through it to give you a bit of context. As you can see, it is a 300 kW DC rated solar system, and then I sized a 40 kW, 80 kWh energy storage system. So we'll kind of refer to that as a 2-hour duration. Actually, why don't I navigate to each of those steps individually just to talk through this. So step 4, solar, again, you can see we got a 300 kW system. And just to give a little bit of a benchmark for pricing, we're coming in at $3 a DC watt, which I think we could all probably agree for a roof-mounted system these days is maybe even on the conservative side. Okay, so that's our step 4 solar configuration. In the step 5 storage configuration, again, for this initial run, and I know I'm moving quickly. I think I got a little bit of lag on my screen. Okay, there we go. For the initial run, I just generically defined a 40 kW, 80 kWh battery system. And I think this is indicative based on what Laura just kind of mentioned a minute ago, that I think based on parsing the entire commercial SGIP database to date, it sounded like the average duration was about 1.8 hours. So coming in at 2, I think is reasonable. And then in terms of pricing, you could see, actually, what did I use here? Let's see, 96,000 total turnkey installed storage cost divided by 80 kWh. Okay, so we're coming in at $1,200 a kilowatt hour on pricing, which again I think is conservative. I think Laura's number, based on the database, was a little under $1,100 per kilowatt hour on average installed for storage systems going after SGIP rebates. Okay, so there's our context. That's kind of the deal we've set up. Let's now, actually, there's one other thing I need to mention, of course, and that's step 2. So for this project here, we're going to model this in San Diego. And this is based on the most recent rates. And we're going to kind of dive into the deep end in rates in a second here with regards to a lot of these shifting time of use periods. But this is the January 1, 2018 effective date rate. We're assuming this customer is currently on the ALTOU schedule, and we're going to look at potentially moving them to the DGR schedule. Okay, I think that's all of the, actually, why don't I, while I'm on a roll here, why don't I quickly do incentives, step 3. So, as Jonathan mentioned, on PACE projects, I think it's traditional that the host customer would capture and would take the incentives and the tax credits for themselves. Certainly if they're a tax-paying entity. So for this deal here, you can see that we've got the federal ITC. Maybe I'll also make a really quick plug. This is kind of cool. We loaded in the new 2017-2018 tax reform bill, 100% bonus depreciation incentive, and we'll actually kind of unpack that in a second. And then over here on the storage side, we're going to take a tax credit on the storage system. And also, I'm going to make another quick plug. And this is something we're incredibly excited about, which is we're finally going global on our SGIP incentives. Meaning, when you run a storage project in California, you're going to have all the SGIP incentives to choose from, and these things are truly flawless in terms of correctly calculating the SGIP rebate based on any parameter of the deal. And for those of you that have kind of looked deeply at SGIP, you're aware there are a lot of nuances. There's degradations based on the duration of the battery. If you take a tax credit, it's one rate. If you don't, it's another. So really excited to finally have global and kind of, we call them, bulletproof SGIP incentives live. So another quick plug on that. Okay, So I think that's all the context. Let's go to step 6, transactions. And right now we have a cash purchase. I'm going to add another transaction. And this account here that I'm running this demo in has been permissioned, has been approved for that K2 PACE financing integration. So we have the opportunity to kind of select from these two transactions. I'm going to choose the one with O&M because I'm going to try to stay consistent here and be conservative in all of my assumptions that I run for this initial case study here. Okay, so now this is really the K2 screen. And as Jonathan talked about earlier, we just kind of did a handshake with K2. And the whole idea here is for us to recreate all of their logic to generate an indicative PACE financing quote based on all the terms of the deal that K2 needs. So let's just assume for the project here we don't have additional overhead cost. We're not going to do a down payment to the deal. Right now the toggle that K2 has open is for a 10, 15, and 20-year term. Why don't we initially here run a 20-year term and try to get that kind of payment as low as we can. I don't think I'm going to run any overrides. And then lastly, I am going to kind of put in some conservative O&M values. So let's just assume O&M starts at year 11. How about we run it at a ½ cent a DC watt? And I'll choose for this initial run to not escalate it. One other really nice feature of this K2 integration is this feature here, which is the property report. So this brings up a hyperlink, and we're tied in with the CoreLogic API, which is a commercial database service that basically pulls data based on whatever address you defined at the facility level. So here's a building in Pasadena. This is actually the building I work out of, and it pulled all the recent assessed value data. Because as Jonathan mentioned, one of the requirements of PACE is having a loan to value ratio within the requirements. So it's kind of nice to be able to just quickly reference this, and it's just kind of an added feature to make sure you're able to check that box. Okay, let's run this and generate a quote. And there are some flags oftentimes, and these are generated by K2 if there are things that you need to look deeper on. So let's just to kind of keep things moving as I look at the clock, I want to kind of keep moving, so I'm just going to go past that. Okay, cool. Now we got a K2 PACE finance 20-year deal and also next to a cash purchase. So let's jump right into a proposal template and kind of unpack what just happened. And I love all these questions that are coming in. Keep them coming, guys. We're going to go to Q&A in just a couple of minutes, so keep the questions coming, and we're going to address them all shortly. Okay, so I've got a standard legacy template. Certainly we can go right to the project summary page and look side by side with that K2 PACE financed project versus the cash purchase. And again, remember, just to give context, this is a solar plus storage project. I think really when you're using this app, you're really kind of zooming right into a cash flow. And this is really where you're going to be kind of interpreting all of this analysis that kind of distills down into this one cash flow statement. So let's jump here. Okay, so you can see the PACE derived payment from K2, including processing fees. And this is based on, what was our total project value? It looks like just under $1 million, call it $996,000. And this is a 20-year term. So the K2 app kind of generated both of these values. And now the rest of this stuff, as you guys are aware, is really kind of the stuff Energy Toolbase specializes in. And we're really going to start to unpack how we got to that first year savings number of $112,000. You can also see the SGIP rebate baking in. You can also see the tax credits and incentives that are baking in. And notice this is run on we did run O&M and an equipment replacement. So we got O&M starting at year 11. And it looks like a pretty significant, obviously this is an adjustable value. Replaced storage system happening in year 16. Okay, so that's kind of zooming in close. Let's kind of let's go to a 20,000 foot level and just kind of start to key in on that right-hand column. Because frankly, this is a lot of times before you put a deal or a cash flow in front of your customer, I think certainly you're going to be saying, well, what is the net? What does the cumulative cash flow look like? And this deal here obviously looks very, very attractive. It almost kind of looks too good to be true, frankly. But again, these are real numbers. This is real load data. And I think we even use kind of conservative assumptions on the pricing side. But you can see this deal is almost a good $600,000 in the money year one, which of course is largely driven by being able to capture that tax credit and depreciation year one. And this deal stays in the black throughout. Okay, so let's kind of just start to iterate here. If this deal is in your lap, you might be thinking to yourself, well, this is just frankly too rich. I'm going to kind of go back in and, you know what, take a little bit more for myself. And this is just a hypothetical, right? So maybe I'm going to crank this thing up to, I don't know, how about $975,000? So we'll build in some more margin for ourselves on the solar side. On the storage side, why don't we do the same? And obviously it's kind of one and the same, right? And let's just rerun that. And this is nice. And this is a real advantage of the K2 app, because you can step right back into that document and those calculated payments are getting regenerated on the fly, right? So now over the term of the deal, I actually should have pointed this out earlier. Now we're coming in at about a $1.5 million cumulative, in the black over the 25-year term. I think before I just toggled those two assumptions, we were coming in at 1.9. And you can see the PACE payment jumped up to 122 versus I think 111 before. Okay, one thing you might be noticing here is, well, wait a second. Is this being run on a pre-tax or post-tax basis? And the answer is, let's jump back into step one of the deal. This one initially is being run on a pre-tax basis. So this is a really important assumption to be aware of. We certainly don't advise or recommend which option to run, but you just need to be aware of what you're saying here. So I'm going to toggle this to an after-tax basis. And basically in Energy Toolbase, when you run a commercial project on an after-tax basis, effectively every single project cash flow, we're going to assume has an effect on net income. Meaning, rather than me say it, let's go back in and do it. So I just try to save that. And by the way, it's kind of also nice, as you make different changes on the fly, I think a lot of you are already aware of this. Like if I was to dial down my escalation rate and I'm running on an after-tax basis, those all update real time right into the dashboard on bottom. So that's kind of even one less step than having to go back into the proposal. You can kind of just instantaneously see what the net effect is. Okay, well, let's step back in and kind of unpack what just happened there. And I know I'm zipping around pretty quickly, but this is actually, I think, in practice what a lot of you guys do. So, okay. So now really the only, meaningful change I made was to say, let's run this entire project on an after-tax basis. And again, the biggest kind of net effect of running it that way is this column here. So let's think about this. Year one, we saved this customer $112,000. We basically reduced their electric bill by $112,000. Okay, well, that's a reduced liability for that customer, which means they have more taxable net income. So running this, and here it is over on this column here, you can kind of start to see the effect of that. Running this deal on an after-tax basis and saving all that money and reducing their liabilities actually works against you. And as you can see here, having really changed nothing else, that total cumulative cash flow just went from 1.6 million all the way down to about 900,000. So really does make kind of a significant impact to the deal. I think it'd be fair to say you could still argue this deal is very, very attractive. And assuming all these assumptions are correct, if you were to present this to your customer, you've probably got a pretty good shot at closing that PACE Finance deal based on how deep we are in the black year one and kind of maintaining that throughout. So that's kind of let's see, maybe there's some other things I want to toggle. I guess kind of just like one big takeaway that I'm trying to drive home here as we think about modeling solar and storage projects, and whether it's PACE Finance or it's a PPA or it's a lease, really being aware of the assumptions that you've defined in the model. So let's kind of step back into the proposal and just unpack that a little bit more. Step 5, energy storage. I'm not going to have an opportunity to go too deep here, but this is a number that I really key in on $75 a kilowatt hour. That number represents the total dollar savings from storage only for this deal year one. So if I put that into dollar terms, I would simply say 75 times the capacity of the battery, 80 kWh. In other words, the storage system alone on this storage and solar project resulted in $6,000 of avoided cost or of savings just from solar. I'm sorry, just from storage. I'm getting my words twisted here. Now, that number there is obviously a function of how you define both the hardware and the software control strategies. This is actually another important one to point out. Don't forget, we chose to take the federal tax credit on our storage system in step 3, right? Well, as a developer, it's your responsibility to know that in order to legally do that, you've got to charge the battery at least 75% of the time from solar. Right now, this is obviously a binary input, but in other words, it would not be, I guess we could say, legal if you were to say, hey, let's have no restrictions on charging, and yes, I'm also going to take the tax credit on my storage system. Another thing I kind of want to toggle, just to kind of show off here, let's turn this on additionally. And this kind of goes back to Laura's point. I know I'm throwing, and we're kind of thinking about a lot of concepts concurrently here, but as we think about those kind of shifting time of use rates, initially this was run just based on peak demand shaving. I'm now going to also turn on arbitrage. Okay, so we're going to stack here. We're going to say when the algorithm goes out and generates a simulation for this project, for this load profile, let's also additionally go out and do arbitrage. And let's save that. We're not going to change any of the hardware specs. And wow, look at that value there. That blended savings from storage just jumped up all the way to $120 a kilowatt hour from 75. That's a really, really attractive number there. And just to give you guys a benchmark, I hear a number there that kind of gets floated around a little bit from some storage folks. I think when you have a project, let's say above $75 a kilowatt hour or $80 a kilowatt hour in terms of storage savings, that's a viable opportunity. I think a guy like Jonathan Pickering at K2 would love to look at your project with you if you have a deal that can achieve that. And this one here obviously really got juiced up. Boy, I'm looking at my clock. I would love to kind of go in here and start to unpack what just happened, because remember, this is now both peak shaving and arbitrage. I'm just not going to be able to kind of go too deep based on how much time we have left, but effectively this strategy was just rerun, and you can see down here in the arbitrage settings. Actually, let's go to the DGR cost. Right, that's a really high on peak rate, and now, as kind of Laura mentioned earlier, it's a lot later in the evening, 4 p.m. to 9 p.m. So this simulation here is additionally taking advantage of, it's doing a lot of discharge in that on peak period. And as you can see here, it's recharging mid-peak, and it's still maintaining that one constraint that said must charge from PV. So, and then again, of course, if we were to jump back into this deal, I'm sure the economics just got even that much better. So the moral of the story here, I know I'm just throwing a ton at you, and it's probably not really effective like when we're thinking about all these things, but it really is kind of the big takeaway when you're running solar plus storage analysis, and then you start layering in kind of outside financing, you've really got to be kind of aware of the model assumptions. And again, this is an example here where we're running it on an after-tax basis, I think with conservative pricing numbers, baking in O&M and a pretty big equipment replacement value in year 16. And this deal still looks pretty attractive. Okay, I'm going to zip through. I got a couple prepared slides, and we're going to go to Q&A. I am definitely running late here. I did mention this in the teaser that I'd be talking on it, so I'm just going to spend maybe 90 seconds running through my slides. If you're probably asking yourself, well, where are those best energy storage opportunities? And these are really the three big drivers. Obviously, you want to have a utility rate that's conducive, high demand charges. We're not going to have a chance to talk about load profile. And then what Laura talked about earlier, she nailed it on the head. In California today, if you're not doing SGIP, you're probably not doing storage, because it's really what makes the project go in a lot of cases and viable. I did pull these down right before this presentation. These are updated as of January 1, 2018. These are 3 of the big kind of default C&I schedules in each of the big 3 IOU territories. And it's fair to say that in California, we certainly do have high demand charges. You can see ranging anywhere from like $17 NC max all the way up to like $28 in the summer on peak. And then this is kind of the exact same slide that Laura had. I just formatted it differently. A lot of folks are aware, January 1, SDG&E just implemented some pretty radically different new time of use rates. This is actually for a residential schedule. The commercial schedules are actually the same, but really the effect that I'm trying to illustrate here is how significantly that on-peak period has shifted to later in the evening. In this case, going from noon to 6 all the way out to 4 to 9. And of course, when you run that through the model and understand the implications on savings of solar alone or solar plus storage, what that all means. Okay, I ran long, but it is what it is. I'm going to now transition to Q&A. So Jonathan and Laura, if you can kind of come back on the line. Let's try to knock as many of these down as we can. And we've got no problem staying late, so we can certainly run for the next 10 minutes here. Okay, a couple questions coming in. Will we provide a link to the presentation deck? Yes, absolutely. I'll be sure when you get that automated email in the next hour, you'll get a link to download the deck, and also you'll see the video. Okay, how about, Jonathan, for you? Hasn't the prepaid PPA been killed by tax reform? Doug is asking.
Thanks, Doug, for the question. No, the prepaid PPA and standard PPAs hasn't been effective because the ITC still remains at 30%. That's the key attribute which has remained constant. So no, we're still seeing a number of companies in the market for the prepaid and standard PPA in 2018 and going forward.
Perfect. I'm going to do one more quick shameless plug here, guys. Sorry, I got to do it, but I want to plug this webinar next week. We're running actually a really specific webinar that's going to dive deep on the effect of those tax reform changes. And this guy here, a lot of you know, Keith Martin, is pretty much the foremost expert in this stuff. He's the author of the CA Guide to Tax Incentives for Solar, among a lot of other things. So really excited to be running this one next week. It's going to be free, and we're going to be diving deep just on the tax reform changes. So sign up, please. Okay, one for you, Laura. Question from Luke. Are the costs, you said the cost of storage on average for commercial projects is $1,100 per kilowatt hour, roughly. Is that before or after the SGIP incentive?
That is before the SGIP incentive. So that is total eligible cost that the developer reports on their SGIP application, which is a required information to be eligible for SGIP. So that is before the SGIP rebate would be applied.
Awesome. Another storage one for you. Actually, this kind of might be more in my lap, but you start, Laura. Chris is asking for the SGIP Step 3 incentives. Isn't 50% of it paid up front and 50% of it paid over 5 years? Can you kind of clarify that?
Yeah, sure. So that schedule where 50% is paid up front and 50% is paid over the first 5 years of operating the storage system, that is for systems sized over 30 kW. And there are other requirements for those larger systems as well. Systems under 30 kW are issued their incentive when they receive their when they submit their incentive claim form and when that's approved. So that the funding for SGIP funding for smaller systems is paid up front.
Perfect. And I'll also mention, Chris and everybody else listening, it's really cool. The new dynamic SGIP incentives that we loaded calculate all of that automatically. So if you're over that 30 kW threshold, you will trigger into that PBI category. If you're not, you'll be under it. So it's really nice. You just select the rebate, we calculate or we estimate what that amount would be correctly. Okay, Ryan's asking a good question, and this is not real intuitive. How do you change the replacement value amount? Because yes, it just plays so huge into what the, bear with me, I lost my spot. This number here, obviously this is really going to be a huge driver of this cash flow. In this example here, it did not throw the deal upside down, but I'm sure you've all seen scenarios where it does. So right now that's managed through the company settings, and there's two ways to do it. Because I ran this deal using generic equipment, there's two settings for it. In the energy storage settings, there is a generically defined equipment value. And then separately, actually here it is right here, what the lifespan is and then what the replacement value is on a dollar per kilowatt hour basis. So that's where you define it here. And then separately, if you were actually modeling a specific vendor's equipment, you would actually have the opportunity to define that yourself. So definitely a user input. And yeah, I want to make that clear because that certainly does play pretty large into what's going to happen on the project. Okay. This might be for Jonathan. Is solar considered a permanent structure change for the property owner? Energy storage. Is that enough to go on there, Jonathan?
Is it? I'm sorry, I'm not sure if I understand the question fully, but
can it be used on leased properties as well as kind of a follow-up to that question? Not sure if that's enough.
Yeah, PACE can be used on leased properties, but you have to. The company that's leasing the building has to work a deal with the building owner because the building owner has to sign the assessment contract. I mean, it's not just with PACE, it's always very difficult to secure financing if you're leasing a building, unless you've got a very long-term lease, because the term of the financing, whether it's lease or PACE, solar equipment lease or a PACE, has to be really longer than the building lease. So those are the considerations. It's certainly a lot easier to work directly with the building owner, but we have worked deals with lessees before, but it has to be a three-way agreement.
Awesome. Kind of a follow-up question on that I'm actually going to take. Steve was asking, does the CoreLogic data require a separate subscription? And the answer is no. That's another really cool advantage of signing up for the K2 PACE financing integration, because you can you don't even there's no toggle on or off. For every deal you run that uses a K2 PACE financing transaction, it will actually scrape and pull that CoreLogic data, which is a nice kind of added feature of using that integration. Jonathan, question for you. What you mentioned you had multiple funders. We have a couple of people asking, what specific, who are you working with? What funders, how many people do you source from, or kind of how does that work? If you can shed a little light on that.
Yeah, thanks for that question. Well, we have a network of different funders. There are about, I would say, a dozen PACE bond investors across the States, and they've all got different appetites, different cost structures. Some prefer very long-term, we'll do 25 years. Some would prefer to do a 10, 15-year deal. And for larger projects, it's worth checking out a few different options. But we have actually closed deals with all of the leading funders, including Clean Fund. We've done a lot of projects with Clean Fund. We've closed projects with Y-Green. We've got projects in process with Greenworks. So we can work with multiple different administrators, from Renew Financial to Hero to LA County and San Francisco County. So we have a number of different options that we can work with. We tend to, well, we are funder and administrator agnostic. Our key focus is just finding the most practical, expeditious route to financing, the best fit for that particular situation.
One last question.
We've been doing this for 5 years and kind of have a good perspective on that. Thank you.
Makes sense. One last question for you, Jonathan. Fengping is asking, generally, what are the costs, legal, application, and otherwise associated with PACE financing?
That's a good question. I mean, the closing costs on PACE relative to, straightforward loan or lease are complex because you've got the county administrator that's going to charge closing costs, and they can be 2 to 3%. You've got the funder that's going to charge closing costs of, around typically between 1 and 3%. And it depends on the structure. There may be additional legal closing costs. So the cost range, it depends on the project size, typically between 4 and 6%. But all of those closing costs are financed as part of the project. There's no upfront cost, apart from the situation where we need to go out and get a new appraisal where the client is going to have to put the money up front from that. But everything else is bundled in, and one of the other advantages, if you closed a project today, you wouldn't actually, the first half year payment wouldn't be until December 2018. If we closed the project at the end of June, the first payment wouldn't be until December 2019. So there are a number of interesting features of the program which can really help the project cash flow.
Awesome. I think I'm going to give the last one to Laura, who's going to take us out. Laura, question is, in your judgment, when do you think the SGIP program will last in each of those three, in each of the three big IOU territories?
Yeah, great question. Really anyone's guess. But I should mention that the SGIP program sunsets statutorily at the end of 2019. So this money is only available till the end of 2019. However, I think, once some of these rate issues are settled, and now that we are pretty aware of the TOU periods, I think maybe people will, developers will really start selling storage. And, you might get some of those soft costs coming down with experience in the industry. So my best guess probably be, I bet all the IOUs will be through step 2, mid-2018 would be my guess. And then at the lower incentive levels, it's sort of anyone's guess at that point. So sorry, not a clear answer, but really anyone's guess at this point where the market's going to go.
Awesome. I think we're going to wrap it there. We're not able to get to every last question, but I'm actually going to forward them to the person who was asked to, and hopefully they can hit you back on email. Thank you guys very, very much. Recording of this is going to be in your inbox in an hour. And really, really want to thank Laura and Jonathan for hosting this today.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you, everyone, for calling in.
Alrighty. See y'all next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.